Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome to this Techstrong learning experience brought to you by DevOps.com. My name is Cody, the host of Techstrong Learning, and we have an exciting panel ahead. First, I have to cover just a couple of housekeeping notes. Today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion, perhaps you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend. The on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live session today. If you look to the right side of your screen, you'll see there are a couple options to engage with our speakers today. The first of which is the chat tab. I'd like you to start warming that up for me right now by letting us know from where you are tuning in. Right next to that chat tab, you'll see there is the Q&A portion. Any questions that you have, we want you to send those into our Q&A. We will try to address those as they come in. However, please give us until the end of the program to pull those into our live program. If you jump over to that handouts panel, you'll see there are a couple blog posts and resources that have been made available for you. So feel free to grab those. And of course, before we close out, we are giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So the topic of our discussion today is observability. And I'm joined by Kit Merker, Chief Growth Officer at Noble9, Andreas Prince, Chief Product Officer at StackState, and keeping us on track today is our very own Mike Vizard, Chief Content Officer here at Techstrong Group. So Kit and Andreas, thank you both so much for joining me today. Mike, you want to go ahead and get this kicked off?
Thanks, Cody. I'm going to start with Kit, but observability has been a buzzword, I would say, for the last year or so. And yet, if I go back in time, observability was always considered to be one of the cornerstones of good DevOps practices. And yet we basically settled for what feels like continuous monitoring. So for folks that are not necessarily deeply engaged in the topic, in your mind, what is the difference between what we've been calling monitoring and observability, and what is that expectation that people should have in terms of what's different?
Well, it's funny you say about the buzzword, because I think the deep practitioners of observability treat it as a very specific meaning. There's this whole control theory about how you can understand a system based on the external factors of the system, and I think it's kind of become more of a more casual use recently. That observability has become a bit of a marketing term, and I think what I think is the most sort of useful way to think about it is it's a set of practices and tools and an aspiration that companies have, which is that they want meaningful insights from their systems so that they can improve the reliability, that they spend less time debugging, they spend less time chasing, that they have targeted data. I also think observability comes with a side effect, which is that people collect as much data as possible, which creates a second order challenge, because now you're wallowing through trying to find the needles in the haystack with the hope that if I can just collect enough data, I can feed that into an AI system, or I can, I'll, just in case I'll have that. And now you've got this massive, I like to call it an observability data lake that shows up. And this is, I think, the kind of the new challenge that observability creates, which is that, this great intention that we would have full fidelity of information about our systems suddenly created a second problem of this new pile of data we don't know what to do with.
Yeah. Andreas, I know you guys have been doing some research in this space, so maybe you want to walk us through a little bit of some of the things that you guys have discovered in terms of just how people are viewing monitoring and observability, or is this something that is maybe a subset of something else in their minds? What do you guys kind of see in your research?
Yeah, well, first to allude to you, Kit, the overload of data, that's definitely happening. We see that everywhere. So also amongst our customers and in the research group we approached. So that's definitely a problem. What to do with that big amount of data? What came out of the research is that the core users, you alluded to that, the real practitioners, Kit, they know what they're talking about. But if you think about where observability or monitoring is meant for, that's supporting all these engineering teams who try to be, hey, you build it, you run it, push their applications to production themselves. They're overloaded with the amount of practices and the amount of data. And what we discovered is, if you truly think about observability or site reliability engineering, if you like, it's not necessarily that you want to build these deep insights or deep understanding. It's much more, how do you troubleshoot or remediate issues as soon as they pop up? And the research that we did is how effective are current observability practices and what actually need to change. And we discovered that in the expert teams like the platform team, the SRE team, it's all fine. People are very knowledgeable. They know how to travel a Kubernetes cluster. They know how the stuff is related. But as soon as you go one level up, regular software engineering teams who need to actually run their applications, they're entirely unaware. And then they go to Prometheus type of dashboards. But then again, they have the data overload. And the outcomes that we discovered is it's much more important to think through how can I utilize the data for doing effective or fast remediation. If you take the SRE process of really doing good remediation of issues. And that's pretty fascinating because we see an overload of dashboards. We've seen people, when we ask, hey, can you show your Grafana dashboard? Well, easily 25 different dashboards just to observe their entire cluster from various angles. So hand it over to an engineer. And then the question is, how do you manage that? And I think that's the next evolution we need to think through is how do we utilize the data for the purpose of business, resilience, troubleshooting, or whatnot. And then the question is, what is the data you really need? So I'm really happy to discuss that and dive deeper into that.
I think Andreas just described dashboard whiplash, right? I mean, that's what people get is they kind of bounce around. That's how that kind of works. Kit, maybe you can walk us through some examples of things that I could do with observability that I could not do before, because with monitoring, I would have a set of pre-configured metrics that I might watch all day long, and I could have, to Andreas's point, 22 different dashboards all monitoring a set of metrics and everything looks good, and yet the system can still be down. So, or at least performing poorly. So walk me through what it is that we can do with observability that we couldn't do before.
Yeah, I think there's in my mind, there's kind of three parts to the system. Okay. There's what you collect, how you compare it, and what action you take. These are the three kind of parts to a true observability system. And as I posted in the chat, observability without action is just storage, which is, really what we're trying not to do is just collect the data and not take action on it. So on the collection side, one of the cool things we have now is so many different ways of thinking about the data. We can collect metrics, we can use synthetics, we have logs, we have distributed tracing, right? There's all these signals that we can collect. And some of that we can get directly from our cloud providers. Some of it we can get from third-party tools like Datadog and New Relic. Some of it we can get from open source tools like Prometheus. So the first thing is making sure we've got the right signals about our system that give us that depth of data. And by the way, that signal data, the shelf life of it is very short. You want that. It's very important to have that high fidelity data all at once, but very quickly, the value of that data for debugging goes down, except for certain cases where the data is interesting, like right after a software update or maybe during an outage or a near miss. The data is interesting during those periods of times. The rest of the time, it's probably boring data. 99.9% of the time, the data is boring, right? That's kind of what we're going for. The second part is comparison, right? So comparison implies that we have some sort of goal. Now, when you look at what you're just saying about, okay, we're watching these charts. Right? So I call this watching the matrix. Remember that? Where he's like got the little green things and he's watching what's going on in the matrix. The idea that we're paying people to sit around looking at charts in 2023 is kind of insane. Like nobody has any spare resources whatsoever, but we're sitting around looking at charts, interpreting the tea leaves. A business person looks at it, it's gibberish to them, right? And they can't tell if the chart's good or bad. I have no idea what's going on. So one of the things that Google and all these other companies have advocated for is setting goals. And we do this at Noble9 and our customers do this, SLOs, right? Service level objectives. Literally just write down the goal you have for your service and make that goal accurate to what customers want. And then the third part is the action, right? And the action I think we think of is you get paged, right? We think, okay, something's broken, the service is down, and I get paged. I like a more nuanced way of thinking about the action. First of all, let's not wait until the service is down. Let's anticipate that a service is going to be down because our error rate is trending toward violating our goals. Again, you can only do this if you have good signals. You can only do it if you have well-defined automated goals described in code. And then let's take the appropriate level of action, right? If I have a small injury, I don't go to the emergency room, right? But if I break my leg, I want to call an ambulance. So we want to Slack the team. We want to send off a page. We want to file a ticket. We also would like to have automated runbooks, right? I do a software release. I notice that my SLO or my service is getting worse. Let's roll back the release. We notice performance is degrading. Let's spin up more servers, not based on the CPU, but based on the actual customer experience of that service. So these three pieces, collecting the signals, comparing them to goal, and taking action, this is a comprehensive way of looking at observability. It's not just reliability kind of solution in one place or the other, but fitting those pieces together. Now, too often what I see is a lot of focus on the signals and a lot of focus on the response, and not a lot of focus on really setting and tuning good goals in the middle, so that you have a comparison to drive the right action depending on what the signal is telling you. And that's what I'm personally focused on quite a bit, is fitting that middle piece.
Yeah. To elaborate a little bit more, and someone in the chat already mentioned it as well, you need to make it actionable, and that's definitely true. And setting goals is a way to think through, but what is it actually that I want to do with the data, right? There's data, but what is it that I want to do there? And I do think that's super powerful. One aspect you didn't call out explicitly, for me, the move from monitoring to observability, or at least the business awareness, is also the fact that we're elevating from a more technical orientation of looking at the world. Do the components work? Is the system up and running? Versus, hey, but what does it mean to the business? And I do think if people are still new into the journey of observability, building that understanding of, but what does it mean for my business, right? And setting goals on the business is also truly important, because ultimately, the system can be up, right? Or having a lot of change, but if the performance goes down, error rates goes up, it's impacting your business. And when we started with monitoring, about 10, 12 years ago in the company I back then worked for, ING, the bank, we had all these dashboards on the wall, and people were actually proud, right? They were allowed to buy 50-inch monitors, right? And just putting amazing dashboards on there. But what is the purpose? And I really noticed that people become aware, saying, hey, but what about the business? And what are the business metrics I actually want to track and then bring into the mix of observability? And then you start sparking the conversation with the business partner, the product manager or the business line manager, or whoever you're serving in a business to business or business to consumer setup. And I do think that's also important to realize that we are not only looking internally focused, but becoming more and more aware of the outside world.
Andreas, you make such a good point about the business too, because one of the things I've found is that the business people, and by the way, there's lots of business people who care about the reliability of service. It could be support team, could be the sales team, could be product managers. The ones who are not in the code are generally not logging into a lot of these tools that are the best for the engineers. And so how do we give them something they can understand, so they can internalize the pressures that we're under? Because we know all software engineering is a bunch of trade-offs, right? We can't make it fast and also high quality. It doesn't work that way, right? We can't do it all. But describing those trade-offs to our business stakeholders, it requires some, bringing some data and information that's just not available, and simplifying it without losing the importance of it is such an important part of solving this.
Yeah.
Andreas, I'm a simple guy, so I kind of describe it this way, right? Monitoring is about the tracking of predefined metrics, and then observability allows me to ask some questions and some queries to actually discover some issues before, to Kit's point, they blow up in my face. The problem when I explain that to people is that they come back with is they fundamentally say something to the effect of, I have no idea what questions to ask in the first place. In fact, if I knew what questions to ask, I probably wouldn't have these issues to deal with because I'd have addressed them. So how do we make people smarter about not just the fact that we have all this data to look at, but to ask the questions that surface the right kinds of things that I'm looking for?
Well, there's one part, the goal setting, and I do think Kit can definitely talk more extensively about that part, but that's definitely helpful, right? So what is it that we from a business would like to achieve, right? Not the kind of the deep down metrics, but the higher level. That's definitely one part. The other one, what I really like to use often is the trace, right? But what about your end customer? So take an end-to-end transaction going through your system, right? And that's tangible because they have the web portal, and then the fulfillment or the request needs to come back. And then going through the chain, which is a kind of technical, but calling out all the services, and then start to explain, but what if we have bad performing components in there? What is the effect, right? Well, high latency, right? So slow response, causing people to leave your website. So taking a concrete example, and then for me, trace is a kind of the most easy to explain, because it's traveling through a bunch of components before the request the customer made is fulfilled. That is a helpful way to start explaining why it matters, right? And then if you see that indeed you're traveling 5, 10, 12 services before a single request is executed, and then all the other components, that's then powerful to explain, hey, and we need to pay attention to the individual components, but also the big picture matters. And then you can start talking about goals, right? Because what about how many of these requests can fill? Then we talk about error rate, we talk about latency. So taking a concrete example often helps to spark the conversation and build a deeper awareness, and then take it from there.
I would say you don't know what questions to ask is a kind of an interesting situation to find yourself in, because we as entrepreneurs or leaders, product people, whatever, we know kind of what we want and what we care about from a customer service perspective. I think what happens is people fall into the trap of just assuming that they must have 4 nines for everything, or that they must have a particular type of reliability target or performance target in order to get customers to use their service. And often it's just not the case. In fact, people have a much higher tolerance, end users have a much higher tolerance for unreliability than most people realize. And it's like, we've gotten into a mindset as users of technology that we'll hit the retry button, we'll refresh the page. If it doesn't work, we know to turn it off and turn it back on again, right? This is something we all know how to do. Even our parents and grandparents know that you got to turn it back off and turn it back on. And reliability engineering actually can take advantage of this fact. It can take advantage of that mindset. What we really need to do is to understand the expectations of how we can create resiliency, which means that the software can tolerate a small amount of failure or some amount of failure. And then we have to define that. But it's an iterative process because the expectations and the systems are changing all the time. And if we can get a baseline of where we are today and then aspire to make it better, perhaps, or at least maintain the same level of reliability for the service. But I think the other thing that really drives the goal setting is trying to understand human behavior and end user behavior in your services. They're coming to your website. Are they abandoning your shopping cart? Are they able to upload their check? Are they able to stream the video? Are they able to buy the ticket to the concert? If you understand the fundamental transaction you're trying to accomplish and their tolerance, sort of their elasticity, right, to complete the task at hand, you can start to set goals that are driven by delivering the service and not by, arbitrary nines or arbitrary goals for the service. That to me is a much more sophisticated and ideally the right way to do it. And what it leads to is better conversations between the teams. It leads to better understanding, less stress, because we're not trying to just make the service perfect and make it as reliable as possible. We're trying to find the happy balance where we can still keep delivering features to customers and keep them engaged in our platform. That's kind of, to me, the reason why this goal-oriented, goal-driven approach is so important.
Yeah. Yeah. What I really like there, what you mentioned, is the word discovery. And everyone starting this journey, and we talk about observability, but for me, site reliability engineering and observability go hand in hand. For me, the SRE practice is also kind of the discovery. But if you start this journey, you don't expect that you know it up front, that you know exactly which goals to articulate. Set a goal, right? And see how easy it is to get to the goal, right? And if it's super easy, well, probably, right, make it tougher or not, right? Some goals are easy to meet and you need to focus on other things. So sparking the conversation and articulating goals as a start, feel free, right? I mean, if you're burning your error budget, you just learn from it, right? Or you discover the areas where you need to improve. So don't expect setting goals the first time will be helpful. The first
goals will be wrong.
Yeah. The other part you didn't mention, Kit, but I do think is close, is on one hand, we can learn from the kind of the customer and system behavior from data we track through observability. The other part, which I do think is really important, is to start tracking usage of the product through what we do, events, for example, right? Using Mixpanel, Amplitude, which is slightly different. But for me, from a business perspective, they go really, really hand in hand. Because if you know how your system is behaving and performing, and you also know interaction patterns in your application, well, then you can really define where you go. Because an abandoned cart, right, to your point, Kit, can be because, well, bad performance or whatnot, but it can also be that they cannot find particular capabilities or products or whatnot that I would expect. So don't solely rely on observability, but augment the data set with product-oriented data that tells you about what they
That's
use or
right.
don't use.
Kit, do you think that there's an opportunity to also do more what-if types of analysis on if I do tweak a service or if I do change this, that, or the other, that I can see what the impact of that is? I think today a lot of that effort is trial by fire. And the question is, can we get to a little more scientific approach to playing around with the application?
Well, this is you teed me up perfectly to mention a product feature we just launched a couple weeks ago. It's funny because the what if analysis is one of the top requests we got actually for Noble9 platform. We launched this thing, the service level analysis, where you can take a historical indicator and do exactly the what if and said, okay, if I had set the goal at a certain threshold, a certain number of nines, how many times would my service have fired off the page, or when would it have been? You can correlate that against real outages, and you can start to tune the SLO based on historical data. Now, that's not to say that is, past performance doesn't predict future results, but at least as a starting point, you can say, okay, we know what actually happened in the service. We know when we had outages. Let's use that as a starting point, and then we can decide how to move forward. This used to be, as you point out, this is a trial and error process. People would set it arbitrarily. Oh, 3.9 sounds good. Let's go for it, right? And being able to do a real analysis in a matter of minutes, try out different settings and get it going, it's a huge productivity boost. And this is the biggest challenge I think people have. They don't know what questions to ask. They don't know what their data is actually telling them. They're focusing way too much on average experiences or sampling, which doesn't do anything, because outages and software systems are all about extreme events. This is what we really care about. We don't really care about the average sample median moment of a running service, because it's the outlier events we care about. We need to look at it differently, right? That is so important, and we're trying to drive that sophistication in the tools so that what seems very easy to do behind the scenes, it's complex, but we should let the computers do the hard analytical work, and we can focus on the business and features and sort of the human side of delivering the software.
Yeah.
All right. To listen to Kit, you have to wonder how it is we got anything to work at all in the first place. But
have you seen the software? I know. It's like, it is amazing, by the way, the progress we've made. If you look at what we're doing right now, we're streaming this call to all these people all over the world. Imagine we were doing this 5 years ago. Like, it's just like the pace of change is phenomenal.
But sometimes, Kit, I dream about going back to the old days with a monolith running on-prem, just a single system with a single data set, right? So don't underestimate at the same time the complexity we introduce for our engineering team, right? So it's amazing, no doubt, but at the same time, also the complexity. And where I sometimes struggle with is if people say, yeah, you now need to adopt SRE practices, right? They just finished the DevOps practice, right? It's another wave after another wave coming towards the team. And you sometimes wonder, but how do regular teams cope with this? How do they deal with all these movements that are coming towards them? I absolutely love it, because it gives us work, right? But it also brings some complexity and knowledge sharing. And in particular for observability, also the topic you mentioned, trial and error. Yeah, let's use the SRE practices around knowledge sharing to also build up the knowledge across teams. What does one team learn? How to spread it across another team. And probably not needed if you're 50 or 100 people in size, entire company. But if you go above 1,000, 5,000, whatever in IT, then all of a sudden, sharing knowledge becomes more and more important there.
Andreas,
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just to say the complexity issue is funny to me, because I worked in the Kubernetes project back in the day, and it was always intended to be something for very sophisticated, large scale kinds of things. And then people kind of caught onto the Docker wave, and they made these little hello world apps that they wanted to, deploy as pods onto multiple clusters and do multi-cloud. And the complexity it's killing the teams. And I see failed projects where people are migrating from VMs to microservices. In some cases, it's the right thing to do because they have reached some sort of scale or reliability requirement, and they have the complexity. But starting there and designing your systems for massive scale without the actual driver for it is a huge mistake. We don't need all that overhead. And by the way, I see the same thing happen in operations teams and marketing teams and other things where they're trying to be too cute, too sophisticated before they solve the core problem, which is, are we bringing value to the people that we're trying to serve? I think that's a common problem we have in sort of modern business, is that we bring complexity to solve simple problems, and that's it's quite frustrating, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah, and to close the circle, that goes back to one of your first comments, and also what we believe. It's not necessarily the data that matters, but what you do with the data, right? So also there, abstracting it away makes a lot of sense to say, hey, but let's forget all the low-level data. It's what you do with the data that will drive the action.
So let's jump to a question from the audience, because we have somebody who's bringing up an interesting point. Is our thinking around observability too narrow, and we're too focused on the applications and the services when there's all this stuff underneath called, the network and infrastructure that impacts everything? So do we need a broader approach to observability, and where are we on that journey? Kit, what do you think?
Well, I think that my first reaction is that some of this is semantics, right? We're like, we need words to describe things, and those words have some meaning, and that meaning, drifts over time. And can we normalize the tenets of observability in a way that makes sense? If vendors didn't exist, we probably could. If it wasn't a term that was, search engine optimized, we probably could get away with doing those kinds of things. But the reality is that these words, especially the ones that people care about, they're gonna get latched onto, and they're gonna drift, and they're gonna change. So I'm less personally concerned with some of these like words and definition, and more about like what problem are we actually trying to solve. And there is something to be said about the underlying infrastructure has different kinds of requirements than applications. And I think one of the mistakes or challenges I've seen is everybody's obsession with like customer happiness as a goal of reliability engineering. Well, nobody's happy because of reliability. I'm sorry. Like, we just gotta, like, people assume reliability is like a basic tenet of using the software. They don't go and load your website and go, oh my God, it works, thank God. And they're saying hallelujah in the streets. It doesn't work like that. There's no happiness there. I think the better question is, what's normal? How do we tell if a system is operating normally? Can we define what normal is? And then the delight and all that comes from other things. So reliability's goal is not really about customer happiness. It's about system normality. And that applies across all of these other systems, the infrastructure, cloud provider infrastructure, application performance. But I will tell you, the big problem right now, in my opinion, is we have so many dependencies that we can't trust. We can't trust the cloud providers. We can't trust our databases. We can't trust open source. We can't trust anything. And the trust that has to be earned over time only comes when people can prove themselves. They keep their promises. Yeah. Reliability goals are promises that other people need to keep. And if we can't even understand what those promises are, I think that's the start. I like to say, because I have these little quips, that a cloud outage is a friendly fire cyber attack. And that's, if you think about it that way, like, it's really a big problem if you aren't prepared or understand exactly what you're getting from all these dependencies we have today. Andreas, I'm sure you have many things to say on this.
Yeah, well, there's one. What you say is absolutely true. Another thing I was reading in the question is about dependencies. Are there instruments out there that can help you understand the dependencies, right? Because it's easy if you're on modern platforms or serverless, right? And you say, hey, but all the infra is abstracted away. I don't care about it. To a certain extent, that's true. Up until the moment that the security group is changing in another team, right? And all of a sudden your app doesn't work anymore. I mean, it's still there. And then if you take a look at the slightly more traditional, not traditional, slightly more non-cloudish environment, right? Where you are still all the way down towards your rack. You need to know how the entire chain looks like. And what we do at StackState is we call it topology. So building your entire graph first. So many people try to derive a service map kind of after the fact, but StackState has pivoted and say, hey, but how does your entire stack looks like from component to component, and then correlate the metrics towards that. And that's in particular important because if then something is happening at the high level or you're signaling something at the high level, you can easily drill down all the way towards whatever, your disk, a database, another service, a security group change. So taking observability really narrow, saying, hey, it's only about metrics, traces, events, and logs and whatnot, I do think is unfair. At the same time, yeah, just doing it the dashboard way is also not helping you either. So I don't care too much about whether or not it's called observability. I mean, the job needs to get done, and we move forward.
Andreas, to follow up on that, do you think that this whole shift to cloud native and serverless and everything else that we're doing is going to force the observability conversation in a lot of organizations, and they may not call it observability, but they're calling it something. And, this is, it's a chicken and an egg question, but it seems to me that the chicken is clearly I go build something until I experience a level of pain, and then I go figure out how to deal with it.
Yeah. I've heard already many times Kubernetes is the next WebSphere, right? So you need to do anything to manage the complexity there. I also think that the counter movement, or probably people don't call it a counter movement, but the entire platform engineer thinking is a kind of a sign that people start to take it serious. So back in the days with the first DevOps move, I was working for ING, and they fired all the infra and operations people, and they say, yeah, we now have DevOps teams, so you build it, you run it. And that was pretty okay in the beginning, up until we now discover how complex and how hard it is. So companies now taking serious care of developer experience, providing a good cloud platform, plus the monitoring and observability tools and practices on top of it, to me is a sign that companies slowly start to understand it's quite a bit that we ask from our teams. So having a kind of a vision, not 60 pages on paper, but what is your vision on what belongs to an engineering team, what belongs to the platform team, what belongs to the SRE team, and just having that conversation, I think is super meaningful. Because if you believe in a platform team who are providing you the cloud resources, well, what is then the responsibility that belongs to that team from an observability perspective? And what is the responsibility that belongs to the application team? And we've seen in the research is that if you don't bring these together, well, you go to the back to the old-fashioned silos. So setting goals together, and then, well, it's just a matter of the SLIs, the service level indicators, the low-level metrics. They are distributed over multiple teams, but they come together in objectives and agreements that you would set. But that entire platform move for me is a sign that the market is slowly maturing and realizing, how we did it is not the way forward. Second, yes, Kubernetes is everywhere, but also based on our research, the larger enterprises, or if you read CNCF research, the larger enterprises are still early days in the real adoption, right? Big scale adoption. So it's there, no doubt, but it will take also still a while before it's massive.
Yeah.
Kit, following up on that, so we have, let's see, logs and metrics and traces and lions and tigers and bears, oh my. And historically, when we had, going back to the days of APM, we would instrument maybe 5% of our applications because it was too hard to deal with and costly. And so a lot of things didn't get monitored. I would argue that the bulk of stuff that's out there today still isn't monitored. So the question I have to you is, how do we make this easier for folks? Do I got to stick an agent in every piece of microservice code floating around out there? Or is there some other way to think about getting observability? Or, what is the best approach to kind of putting the right frameworks in place to get the data to observe?
I think I have a couple thoughts on this. One is I think that you should give teams choice. That's my number one thought on this, is that whenever I've seen organizations try to standardize on one approach to anything, organizations of a certain size, okay, I'm not talking about three dudes and a dog. I'm talking about real software teams, big software teams. Whenever they try to standardize on one thing, whether it's the project management approach, the programming language, the frameworks, build process, whatever. It doesn't matter what it is. When you try to standardize on one thing across a large organization, it fails every time. And I get so frustrated with that. And there are some things that you do need to decide to kind of create a standard on, but it's when you can do loose, kind of loose agreements, loose coupling of these different things. So my first advice is don't try to find one silver bullet. Let the teams experiment and try different tools, open source and vendor tools for measuring and monitoring things. Second thing is, the open source stuff has gotten really good. And so I do encourage people to do that. And I also look at what the cloud providers, and everybody's moving to cloud, what the cloud providers offer natively is getting better and better as well, and can be quite a cost-effective way to add monitoring and things like that. I also, for myself, I look at these external synthetics as a really strong, powerful way to get more customer-oriented information and data, but it really comes down to using different tools, letting teams experiment and finding ways to add this, and really working backwards from what action you're going to take as well. I think start trying to instrument everything, quote unquote, or use something that's cool just because it sounds cool is not really going to give you the result you want. You got to think about it in terms of working backwards from the action, how you're going to get greater insight and also solve the problem. So I don't know, maybe not a very concrete answer, but that's a philosophical answer to the question, I guess.
Well, just to follow up on that, I know you guys talk a lot about service level objectives as code. So where does that fit in that context? And how does that count in the spectrum of things? Where is that?
Well, it's an interesting I guess solution. It really comes from this sort of GitOps and infrastructure as code concept. And what we try to do is basically take what we see people doing for defining infrastructure and applications as code and configuration languages. We try to mimic that same exact idea. So I like to say this gets us from meetings to pull requests, because now instead of sitting around arguing about stuff, we can just put it in code and describe it accurately. And even though we might disagree about what the SLO should be, we don't disagree about what it is at that moment at this changeless number. And one of the cool things we got to do is build this open source project called OpenSLO, and it's on openslo.com. We didn't do it alone. We did it with GitLab and Red Hat and Dynatrace, and Sumo Logic made a really big contribution last year. And we've seen more and more adoption of OpenSLO as kind of a quote unquote standard. And the idea of it is that it's actually a pretty lightweight system. It describes a specification. It has a small command line tool, a couple command line tools that let you do manipulation and validation of the SLO definitions. And the point of this is that it's vendor agnostic. It's something that everybody can agree on in terms of the description, but it also is, becomes sort of your IP, right? If you're going to make an investment to describe all your SLOs and you decide to move to another vendor, or maybe using 2 or 3 vendors, wouldn't it be great if you had sort of one language to describe that in one place? And this is similar to what we saw with Kubernetes and with Terraform and other kinds of languages. So that idea, but leads to this productivity, because now you can go find it in GitHub, you can copy and paste, you can share with each other standards that are reproducible. And that really increases the productivity, becomes a very dev-centric developer experience way of building this and driving adoption. It also allows you to do conformance checks. Like, look, you can't release this software if you don't have SLOs defined. You can actually check that and break the build, which is a really powerful way to drive behavior. Because what we're talking about here is really driving a cultural behavioral change within these developer organizations. Whether they're building infrastructure or building apps, they need to start, if they want to drive reliability results in this sort of more modern way, then they need to actually adopt these set of practices. Well, you're not going to get that by yelling at them, right? You're going to get it by breaking the build. That's how I look at it. So that's really what it comes down to for slows as code.
But it's pretty fascinating, Kit. You started your answer by saying, "Hey, but it's up to every team to pick the tools they prefer, autonomy," which I'm absolutely a big fan. And you ended your conversation by more or less saying, and it would be good to standardize around the same way of defining your SLOs. Right, and it's not to put you on the spot, but that's a kind of the balancing act, right? How can you find tools that are kind of the lower level tools that are to the heart of the teams, right? Often tech specific, right? Because an observability tool doesn't fit on every technology, right? Or how you deal with that. And at the same time, what is the level of standardization? And in your case, you're saying, hey, but what if you could articulate your goals at a kind of a predefined level? Likewise, right, I've seen it in larger enterprises. It's fine whatever you use in development, but we need to find a way to standardize if you push to production, right? Simply from a compliance perspective, right? And whether or not you do everything yourself and then you merge it into a Git action or whatever, that's perfectly fine. And also in this observability practice, we need to balance that out, right? What are the 3, 4, 5 tools that a real large bank, let's say Bank of America, is able to use? Knock yourself out, and what is the level that we come together? And I think that's important.
Yeah. So to be honest, I don't see a contradiction, because the choice that people get to have amongst different teams, you still need some API or some conformance. And by the way, I don't expect that you'll get everyone to use or buy it. In fact, we have people who are doing slows as code in Terraform and we have a Terraform provider for it as well. The OpenSLO standard versus the Terraform standard. There's lots of ways to do it. The practices catch on because this is how developers think, and we see that the GitOps approach has gotten a lot of attention. But I see your point about it, but I don't actually see it as a contradiction because it's letting people have choice, but having compatibility.
Yeah, but I can imagine that there are people here in the audience that are in a larger enterprise and that say, "Hey, but I'm forced, right, to a single standard."
Right.
Do you have suggestions how they could deal with that? How they should balance or have that conversation with their manager?
Well, when we're pushed, I think there's a lot of people who believe that standardizing will create efficiencies. And what I've seen over my maybe too long career so far is that there seems to be like a pendulum that swings toward, decentralization, 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 and that constant flow is what keeps us in business, I guess, right? So often I think it's figuring out which way the wind is blowing right now and positioning what you want to do is moving in the right direction towards that thing, maybe the right political move in a larger organization. And it is hard right now trying to convince your boss is maybe one of the hardest problems of engineering productivity, right? Because you're trying to balance between these, do I buy something? Do I build something? Do I, and right now I think people are moving away from building everything and moving toward buying solutions that work because the constraint today is actually on headcount more than anything else. This is what I'm seeing, at least in the market with our customers. The constraint is on headcount to build internal infrastructure that's not core value, is just not being tolerated. And I think that is the conversation to have right now is how we're going to get the maximum reliability, performance, innovation, efficiency out of our organization. Where certain things we have to do ourselves, certain things we can lean on other people for, and we have to be smart about those decisions.
I'm sure there are some CIOs and CTOs watching this that just labeled both of you as troublemakers, but other than that.
I'll tell you a funny story with plenty of time. I once had to present at a railroad company here in the Netherlands, and the people are aware there's only one, so you can guess which one it was. And I had a kind of a provoking final slide, and my slides got reviewed up front, and I was friendly asked to remove that particular slide and not talk about it. So there was actually censorship going on for the simple reason my message was contradicting their vision and direction. So but hey, let's spark the debate, right? Let's think it through. I honestly do think developer experience is super important. If one of your seniors comes towards you and would say, I had it twice, once at ING. We had a big data warehouse, and one of my most senior engineers came to me and he said, I think we should rebuild it from scratch, and this is what it would bring us, right? And it was about processing time, so we could close the window. It was almost going to real time, but also the code base we had to bear with us. And honestly, it was the best advice he gave, right? But from a product owner perspective, it felt like a burden, right? Because it would take half a year, half of his capacity. But the end result was amazing. So sometimes these senior engineers, they know really well what's going on in the market, and trust them if it goes about DevOps, CI/CD, observability, monitoring, SLO setting, whatnot. I think that's super important.
Kit, there's a question here from the audience about how to balance something along, how do I get to my response times if I'm relying more on automation, things are complex and there's a lot of toil in the system. So do I kill the toil first and then I kind of start measuring things? I'm not quite clear where the question's headed, but do you have any advice?
Well, I was looking at this question. I'm glad we're going to take a stab at it. So it's interesting because toil, as most people, as I understand it, it's a very particular type of work. It's the work that you do that's not really adding long-term value, that you have to, you want to drive it out of the system because you're going to keep having to, do whatever it is, feeding care for your pet servers over and over again. And then the goal is that you would have, for the worst toil, you would start to automate that away, and you would build, tooling to kind of avoid that, because the toil is just waste. That's not to say that all complex processes, right? And I think this is the point of the question. Not all complex processes necessarily are toil. In fact, not even all manual processes are toil. There are some things that you want to do manually that actually does add considerable value, or you might have things that are black swan events that you have to handle manually that it's not worth it to automate or to create complexity around. And I think this is one of the challenges is people think, you should, kind of automate everything. The point about response time, the trick that I've found to improve response time is to think about your incidents in terms of defense instead of response. And people want to respond to events as quickly as possible. And what I recommend is to actually think about it as how do you defend the service from downtime in the first place, right? How do you quantify the risks of downtime, prioritize them based on the potential impact to the service's total uptime or SLO, however you want to think about that, and then identify mitigation strategies for each. There's a great resource. I'll link it in a minute here if I can find it. Maybe Urza is listening. She can find the Google CRE risk analysis spreadsheet. It's an amazing resource that I use all the time and I recommend to everybody. That helps you go through and step by step and quantify the things that are driving downtime or potential downtime in your service. And this is what I've found to be the best way to reduce response time is to actually get ahead of these issues by having these mitigation strategies in place and also looking at how the service is trending toward an outage, which means you have to have fine-grained enough idea about the degradation of the service. Now, that's not to say you're going to avoid all downtime, right? You're going to have to respond as well, but this can greatly reduce the response time and make it much, much tighter.
And just to add on that, Kit, I think what is also super important is to understand where you are with your application in the lifetime, right? So some of the actions, some automation only starts to matter if you need to do it many, many times. So let's imagine you're building a new product, right? And there are only 2 or 3 customers using your particular SaaS offering. Automating the full provisioning, right, in minutes potentially doesn't matter much because that's not the goal of where you're looking for. If you're then further down the line and you have hundreds of customers, well, then all of a sudden other criteria start to matter and you need to take care of them as well. So depending on the lifetime where you are, also the level of automation truly matters. Early on, if you're a real engineer, right, you probably push a little too far for automation because, but if we automate it, it's much easier, it's repeatable. And sometimes that's true. But if you're just striving for finding product market fit or even earlier on, all the automation doesn't matter. It's just, do the people need to use this? Do they like it? And then push it out. So depending on where you are, make sure you set the right goals and the right level of automation as well.
Andreas, let me ask you this next question. Budgets are not infinite, and we have all these monitoring tools, and sometimes organizations have 10, 15, 20. Would observability allow them to rationalize some of those monitoring tools, or is this an additional layer that I apply on top of and alongside of, but it's not really about replacing my existing monitoring tools?
Well, in theory, you could definitely bring down the amount of tools. In practice, what we see happening is every new wave of technology coming into the enterprise also has a supportive kind of group of tools around it that would do more or less the same practice as we did before, and monitoring, but now it's called observability for the new wave of technology. And then often the question you need to ask, is it worth rationalizing the old stuff, right? That becomes a little less, the level of change goes down, right? So I do think if there are systems that are pretty stable with an extremely low change frequency because they're done with developing, they're just running in the back of an insurance company or telco, changing monitoring tools, right, for the sake of changing, because then we have one tool less, I do think doesn't matter much for the results of the company. So whenever there are waves coming up, it brings its own ecosystem. Take a look at the CNCF landscape, right? It's exploding big time, but that's a sign of slowly maturing and going there. I would say, and people who are using commercial tools, some of the monitoring tools are freaking expensive, right? So then it might pay off to make a pivot to another tool. I won't call out names, but that might be a good choice from a cost perspective. And the other one, which we now see from a cost, is how can I bring down my cost? I'm not a big fan of then recommending, if you already have an established tool, to take it away and go for an open source solution, right? Because then you have the cost of the effort of building it, transitioning. So the short answer is it depends, Mike.
All right. Kit, you want to add to that? Do you know any secrets that you want to share for funding these things?
where does new budget come from? This is the fundamental question, right?
It's true. Yeah.
I wish I knew where it came from. Budgets are a mysterious and magical thing. They come from showing value over time. I mean, one of the things that I personally am trying to do these days is to set my sights much lower on initial purchases and come in showing a great value for customers and helping them rationalize their strategy and really understand what's going on. Oftentimes, they actually don't know what they're getting out of their tools, and they also are paying a lot of money, to Andreas's point, to collect a lot of data they may or may not need. And they think that, oh, well, I'll just switch to this other vendor. And guess what? The other vendor just wants your money just as much as before. And they'll tell you whatever discount they want to say. And switching to something fundamentally cheaper is actually pretty hard to do. It's actually it's one of the I think most difficult things. One way or the other, right? You're going to pay it because you hurt your reputation because you had an outage. You're going to pay it because you paid the vendor. You're going to pay it because you paid your team to run the open source. You're going to pay it somehow. And really shifting to this higher level of productivity to lower cost, it's maybe the biggest challenge these teams have. They get these false savings, and this to me is, I think, one of the most insidious places. One place that you can find budget right now, and I don't mind saying this one out loud because I think a lot of people are in this. Some people overcommitted to their cloud providers.
Exactly.
They thought they would get a big discount from buying, making a commitment, or they thought their business was going to grow faster, so they committed to Amazon or Google or Microsoft, and repurposing that for purchasing software solutions through AWS Marketplace or Google Cloud Marketplace is a hidden treasure right now. And for people who are in that situation, this is something to consider, right? If this is the time you want to try out a new solution and really get it in the door, you can buy it using AWS Marketplace, use your existing cloud commitments that were use them or lose them anyway. And it's kind of like free money. It's not exactly free money, but it is an interesting solution to this procurement process right now. And it also removes a lot of the legal reviews and everything with standard terms. So that's one practical tip I'll give you that I've seen quite a few people doing.
That's viable. Andreas, you cannot walk down the street these days without somebody smacking you over the head, talking to you about their chat GPT-like thing. Is observability kind of a stepping stone to AI and IT operations and all this data that we're collecting? Is that going to fuel all these models we want to build, or is that all wishful thinking?
I honestly think it's wishful thinking because data without structure is pretty hard to understand. So you need to have good structure first before you can do all the magic with AI. I'm going to say it. We've been having the AI Ops message quite long on our website, and it worked really well. It worked really well because there were a lot of innovation projects that were going on in companies focusing on AI Ops and whatnot, and we really benefited from that movement. But now we're coming towards the era where people start to think through, hey, but do I need it? What is it actually that I need, right? With budgets getting tight in the last 1.5 years. So we see a tremendous decrease of the ask for AI Ops. And I do think that's because people start to realize, but what is it that I really need to do? So what we're doing at TechState is that we're not, AI Ops is not the goal. AI Ops can never be the goal, right? The goal should be reaching your targets, should be efficient troubleshooting, should be whatever. So we're pivoting it and we're using the data and the magic that happened under the hood to be better in troubleshooting specific, because that is a problem that will pay off straight away, whether or not it's meeting your goals, whether or not it's improving reliability or making customers happy or whatnot. So we're pivoting our thinking and saying, AI Ops is fun. There's a lot of data, but how do you utilize the data for a super specific purpose and goal rather than magic that goes on in the company? So I'm stepping away from the belief that AI Ops is the next move after observability. I'm full into the belief that due to the fact that we have structured data, that we can do better other things, right? The what if scenarios, the prevention, the early detection and alerting, whatever, right? All these type of things. So my thinking is pivoting in the last 1.5, 2 years. I don't believe that AI Ops will break through. I don't know if there are any suppliers in the chat here, but
all right, Kit, before you answer your thoughts on that, though, I do want to thank somebody for their human intelligence. If you have not been paying attention to the chat, Urza has been posting all kinds of interesting additional content for you guys to go find and link to. So you should all check that out, because as I'm watching this is much better than ChatGPT will ever be. Kit,
how do you know that Urza is not an AI?
I don't.
I guarantee you that she's not. And Ursa, by the way, is an amazing community leader in the slow conf community, and she organizes all kinds of meetups and stuff like that too. So you gotta give it to Ursa. She's amazing.
Mm-hmm. So what's your thought though on AI? Real, not real, going to change the world? Or, a year from now, we'll be asking us what was all the fuss about?
I am never going to predict or discount the possibilities of what technology can do. I think that there's a lot of promise in AI, but these things can't do everything that we want them to do. And I think there's a responsibility question. I think here's my thoughts on AI ops. Okay. So number one, Google doesn't use it for their operations. They use SLOs. This is how they do it. SLOs are a statistical analysis tool that are actually understandable and tractable, and you don't need AI for it. The second thing is I look at the paradox of automation. The more you automate, the less you're involved, but the more critical your involvement. It's self-driving car, right? It's great. It drives while you're sleeping until it doesn't, and you have to grab the wheel. And that participation is part of our systems. Driving a car is much simpler, to be honest, than running large-scale software. And maybe the direct impact on life and limb is worse in a car, but the complexity of these systems is quite high. And we're trying to trust the automation to do it. We need humans in the loop. We need to be able to understand what's going on. I'm not ready to hand the keys. Now, that's not to say you can't use AI for augmentation of particular processes, or you can't use it for analysis and things like that. But I wouldn't give it, turn it into my sysadmin at all. And I think it's interesting, Andreas was pointing out the innovation budgets. I'll tell you, the number one thing I've seen is that innovation budgets are pretty much cut these days. And so it actually is encouraging to me that innovation budgets was what was going to the AI ops vendors. It's the first I've heard that, but it makes perfect sense. And I'm personally interested in solving real problems that are facing these organizations today. Like, we're not sleeping, we're not shipping fast enough, we don't have enough people to keep the services running, we got to keep the patches going so we can stay secure. Like, those are the kinds of problems that to me are very practical, very tangible problems that organizations have. And you can't scrape together a few bucks to make the team more productive. Like, that's what needs to happen to make these things happen. So AI sounds cool, but it's expensive. Like, if you're not, the way I look, it's like you're not willing to pay for some basic tooling to make these teams productive today, but you're willing to go and chase an AI dream. Like, that to me is you really need to question your priorities. And again, CIOs can say I'm a troublemaker, but it's important to really wrap your head around how am I going to measure short-term ROI, return on investment, short-term? Am I going to see a tangible difference in my team happiness, in the productivity, in our delivery, in our reliability and reputation? If I can't see that in 3 months, this project is not worth doing, right? And that's what I see with people who are adopting SLOs. I see the change overnight. So that's what we're staying focused on.
All right, folks. Hey, I want to thank both our speakers for sharing their knowledge and insights. An hour has flown by again. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Cody, who's going to take us out.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. And to Kit and Andreas, thank you both as well for joining us. I'd like to remind everyone that this session was recorded. So should you want to rewatch this, you should be receiving an email with a link to access the recording on demand. Or, of course, you can find it living on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars. The 4 winners of our $25 Amazon gift card drawing are Samil B., Galina D., Paul B., and Ali C. So to our 4 winners, congratulations. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. It should be receiving that via email in about the next 48 hours. If you don't happen to see that email, please do check your spam folder just in case. So Kit, Andreas, and Mike, thank you all for joining me. And to our audience, we really appreciate you spending the last hour with us. We do just want to ask for one extra moment of your time for a survey that will pop up as soon as we close out. Let us know what you thought about our program today, or maybe what you'd like to see on a future program. Either way, we hope to see everyone at an upcoming Techstrong learning experience. Have a great rest of your day. And to everyone who joined us, thank you once more.
Thank you. Enjoy.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much.